There are many questions in life. Why are we here, or does DJ Khaled ever wear a shirt, or why does Yamamuro's work feel so stiff? Now, real talk, I think people are a little too harsh on this man, and don't give him the respect he deserves. Yamamuro didn't come into the series with Dragon Ball Z and onwards through GT and recently Super, or even the original Dragon Ball series. He's been around since the days of Dr. Slump, Toriyama's first hit series, which is incredible. There were others such as Minoru Maeda, who worked as a chief animation director on Dr. Slump, then worked all the way through Dragon Ball and into Dragon Ball Z, but few, if any, have been with the series since Dr. Slump through Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball GT, and all the way to Super. And all the great work he has done over the years should be respected regardless if you are happy with his current style. Now, there are several areas as to why his artwork feels plastic at times, and I'm going to break this down into several points. Number 1, style. This is in regards to how the face, hair, eyes, mouth, etc. are drawn. Number 2, highlights. Much to contrary belief, people usually think the reason his artwork is stiff is mainly because he uses highlights. However, many others, especially Toriyama, used them, and I think it's more so how he uses, or should I say misuses, highlights, which is the problem with his work. Number 3, line work. 4, colors. 5, how he places colors. And the annoying thing is that if he at least improved one of these aspects, it would make his work look so much better. And looking at the style he draws in is the best example to first start off with. Now, keep in mind that many of these points that are listed overlap into each other almost always in the examples I'm going to be showing. So with style, it is such an important thing. So like right here, we have Gohan drawn back in 1993 by Yamamuro, and on the right we have some art from those intermission slides halfway through the episode, or promo artwork, whatever. And let's start with the nose, which is drawn really stiff, just coming straight down without any curve or variation, and a simple triangle defining the shading, whereas in the original the nose actually curves out and the shading is drawn much closer to the nose and helps define the form of the nose and actually feels like a three-dimensional object. And probably the most noticeable thing, and which really helps sell the piece on the right, is the eyes, which are actually drawn with a curve, as well as the eyebrows, whereas the one from Kai is almost drawn in a straight line, and the eyes themselves curve very little, making the expression seem stiff once again. With the hair, it is actually drawn fairly good overall, and although it isn't as crucial to the piece as the other points I've mentioned, with this strand here, it kind of just pokes out to the side and doesn't hang down naturally like the left does, and as well as not being larger from the top and coming smaller down to the bottom like hair usually would. And with the ears, that's the only thing that is okay, and minor nitpick, you notice with the blood it actually curves down into and over the eyebrow, again defining form to the face, whereas with the newer one on the left it comes just straight down and doesn't change path, making his forehead feel flat. As well as, which I just noticed, it doesn't have any lines around the top part of the eyebrow, again defining the form, defining the muscle, and giving expression, which doesn't make the character or picture feel flat. And also, how could I forget the head, which is drawn larger to his body, again unlike the left. And literally just as I was about to move on, I realized the hairline is squashed up here for whatever reason, and I think it's partly because he drew the ears up too high or something, and the hairline here usually starts from the ears and goes up. I don't know, but there are some more features I could discuss, but that's enough for this one piece. In regards to purely style, that basically explains the majority of the issues with his current take on Dragon Ball. And here is an example with just style change and 2 other boxes ticked, good color placement and good line work. You can clearly see how much more expression and less two-dimensional the character feels. The shading beneath the nose actually curves and isn't just one straight line. The muscles near the neck actually curve, unlike so much of the art. You can also see a bit of line variation, giving it just a little more depth. The eyes curve inwards and, due to good color placement, accentuate form, again carrying through the expression and making the image feel like a three-dimensional character created in a 2D space. And this goes to show that even with all the highlights and I guess less vibrant colors, which I'll get into later, you can still create an excellent image if you keep the style in mind, and most of all, its consistency. Why should characters be drawn in a completely different style and a worse off looking style to how they appeared in the previous series? Like with GT, you could kind of get away with it since it takes place after Z, and I guess you could say that they are much older than they were in Super, but as we all know, Super takes place in between a time skip, and therefore the designs should be consistent with that time period. And with his style, it can fluctuate. Like sometimes it's better, not as good as his previous work from the 90s, but still better. But then sometimes it's just completely worse. And keep in mind in general throughout this video, I'm not saying that this is outright bad artwork. My frustration is more that it's such a far cry from the work he once put out. 2. Highlights. Now, as I said, this is usually the main criticism to why his work looks stiff and plastic. However, it's more so how he misuses them and the colors he also combines them with, plus a couple of more things, give or take. And highlights were used a heap throughout Toriyama's work, and most likely Yamamuro's reason for including them. They were also used by others such as Nakatsuru and several others, and one of the first reasons, which kind of ties in a little with my fourth point regarding colors, is the colors he combines them with. For example, let's look at this promo work from Path to Power. And although the resolution is kind of garbage, the highlights don't actually feel like light reflecting off the skin as much as the one on the right, because the base tones and shade are quite dull, whereas on the right the base skin tone is a deep tone and therefore contrasts the reflection much better, making it feel less plastic. And the same goes for Toriyama's and Nakatsuru's work. You'll realize usually when they use highlights, the skin is usually a deep shade, and this goes for Yamamuro's older work as well as where he made much better use of them. But another reason why the way he applies highlights makes a character feel plastic is also to do with the static way he draws it. For example, he draws it in the same place and a similar size, but more so it is usually quite sharp. A good example of what I'm trying to get across is with an older poster of his, where as you can see the highlights have a curve to it here and isn't overall drawn so angular and pointy, giving it flow, allowing it to appear like light is really hitting and reflecting off the face. Another small point which ties into the colouring is that also when painting on celluloid, the colours actually slightly blended into one another, creating a smoother transition for light, etc. shade compared to digital art. And this is part of the reason I originally thought his work looked stiff. However, with a filter like in the latter part of DBS or the current movie, or even just using the blur tool or a different brush, etc., this can be fixed so easily, and the colors can blend over just a bit more, allowing for a smoother transition with the light / shading, which is a slight thing on the side and is part of the reason the Universal Survival arc didn't feel so plastic, but also due to some color changes, but I'll get to that later. Now, number 3, line work. Having a variation of line width in your work helps create depth, and a good example is from an older piece of his here. As you can see, the outside of his face is drawn with a thick line, meanwhile the details inside are drawn much finer. However, in newer work, this is kind of pushed to the side. Instead, the line work here, for example, has little to no variation, and therefore just lacks a bit of that extra depth. Of course, this isn't a huge issue. This picture suffers much more from color placement and colors, etc. But another thing that I can't help but notice is that it's like he's using the ruler tool in Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator just because how stiff the lines look. Of course, I don't know if this is a tool he actually uses, but that's just a feel I always got from his line work. But now let's get to number 4, the colors. Now this isn't as important as the style in which he draws, but it still does play a part and reduces the effect of the highlights as I mentioned before. And so if we look at previous work, whether throughout the series or promo work, almost always deep, vibrant tones are used, and the same goes for Toriyama's work. However, in Yamamuro's current era, he still seems to stick by these duller tones, and I think it's clear his work suffers as a result. An example is how the third tone here is much darker than the second tone here, and creates further depth and helps to define form. However, the picture on the left, the third tone is much duller and doesn't contrast or define form nearly as well, and as a result it feels a little plastic, especially since I guess plastics usually have duller tones. Now this picture here from Dragon Ball Heroes is an example of, even with the highlights once again and his current style, that when he uses fairly vibrant colors, it does make the character feel just a little bit less stiff, and the only reason it still does is more down to the style, as I said, that he drew it in. The colors in this piece are great, and it also has that filter which slightly blends in the colors just that little bit more. And this final image here is another example that you don't always necessarily need white highlights. By just using a really light base tone and deep colors for the second and third shade, you can create a heavy contrast like light or aura is shining on the character without having to use highlights at all. And this worked out well throughout Dragon Ball Z, so there's no real reason for it not to be implemented again. Number 5, color placement or interpretation of light shining onto the character. So this one is quite important because it kind of heralds back to his drawing style in regards to eyes, nose, ears, etc. and how he draws them very stiff and with very little curvature. And the same goes for how he colors. Back in Z, it was common for the shading to come out to define the form of the face and for the edges to have some sort of roundness. And in GT it did shift here and there, and although I don't know exactly 100% that he drew this particular scene, it does look exactly like his work. And on a side note, it provides a great example once again that even with highlights, different colors, and a slightly different art style, if he has some of his problems tweaked, such as colors used rightly to define form and not coloring in tones so sharply, adding curvature to features such as eyes, the mouth, etc., also adding a slight blend between colors, can actually make the piece look three-dimensional, and is why this picture doesn't look plastic. But back to my original point of the sharp way he colors, which isn't a huge problem, but once again just adding a bit of roundness to the edges, and especially with the highlights like Nikatsuru did here for example. But back to the main point, color placement. So usually when you shade, you basically interpret a light source is shining down onto your character, then you block out areas that are absent from the light, and when doing this you help define the form of the object. And so with classic work of his, you can see how effective the light looks here, shining down onto Goku's pants compared to the picture on the right. Now this does bring point number 4 into play in regards to vibrant colors that contrast well with each other and are not too similar. But the areas he has shaded out, he just uses the second tone for the whole entire side, and you can also see that it curves as the light hits the pants, and right in between the creases there is a small amount of brown used for the third tone, whereas with the one on the right the colors are not as meticulously placed. Instead of the second tone curving inwards, it sort of just goes straight down, making the leg feel like an action figure. The third tone is also used too much here with the skin, and should be reserved to the parts furthest from the light to help more effectively define the form of his gi. And with the shadows for Goku's armband, the second tone barely curves at all, and again makes the arm look stiff, and should include a little more shadows on the other side near the crease, for example like with Gohan's here. And this also goes for shoes in regards to actually making the shadows curve. And final point is the top part would look slightly better if it was blocked out by light entirely like this side of Gohan is here. And I guess a side note is also to take notice of how the clothing is drawn much more fluffy, and going from the center it gets slightly larger as it comes down because part of it is tucked into Goku's belt. These little things are what make a character feel alive and three-dimensional. And so that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it and have learnt that Yamamuro's work feels stiff for a lot more reason than just highlights, and I hope you learnt some new tips to apply to your own artwork. And I had a lot of fun as usual making this video, and this has been one I've been waiting to do for so long now. I'm happy to have actually finally got around to making it. I was originally going to finally stop putting it off and do it back in August, but a lot of people wanted a part 2 for the Young Gigi vs Toyotaro video, so I put it off again and made that video instead. But that ended up taking forever to make, and all I felt like doing after was just doing drawing videos. So yeah, it took a while to get around to it, but here it is. And the next video planned will either be a speed paint or talking about the evolution of Goku's design in regards to Toriyama's style. I know a lot of people enjoyed the evolution of Toriyama's art style, and this video will be structured very similar to that, but just talking about Goku this time. And in the future I might continue it onto other characters as well, so I look forward to making those videos, and I will see you next time.